Assalamu alaikum and welcome on this Monday. I am your host today, Ashley Pearson Khan, for another International Muslim History Month chat. I'm so excited because I think this is going to be another fun learning experience. I've been learning so much so far. This is our third session now, so we've got 5 in total. So, welcome to International Muslim History Month 2026. For too long, history has been written by others, and today we're taking the pen back. Founded in 2021 by World Hijab Day organization and recognized from New York to the global stage, this month is about more than just dates, it's about impact. We are live every Friday this May. Unfortunately, we did have to reschedule, so it's Monday, but that's all right, as long as we're here, right? So we are here to celebrate Muslim thinkers, the creators, and the icons who shape our world. So you can watch us every Friday at World Hijab Day on just about any platform: Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram. Let us know what country you're watching from today. We'd love to know. And today I am joined by Hassan Munir. He's a historian and educator. He has pursued an MA in history from the University of Toronto. He has written and taught about various topics of Islamic history for over a decade in Canada, the US, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. He is part of the team at Yaqeen Institute. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you and assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be talking about this because I think this topic, which is, Muslims in the making of the Americas, is so important. So I am ready to get started if you are.
Yes, let's do it. Bismillah.
Awesome, great. So my first question is, how far back can we go when we're talking about Muslim presence in the Americas?
I think that's the best place to start because for historians, this is something that we always grapple with as to what is the actual starting point, because every starting point that you pick will have like a series of causes and things that led up to that. And so do you factor those in and then you keep pushing the story back? So I always like to talk about the history and the presence of Muslims in the Americas with this seemingly unrelated starting point of actually a member of the community of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in his time, a very young member, a young child in the Prophet's days in Medina. His name was Uqba ibn Nafi, and he would grow up and become one of the Muslims who carried Islam across North Africa when the Muslim empire was expanding, westward. And it is said, there's a story that when he reached the Atlantic Ocean in Morocco, he actually rode his horse into the ocean because he had come all the way from Medina to now the Atlantic Ocean, and he rode his horse into the ocean as far as he could go on the horse. And he says these famous words, and again, this is kind of a legend, that if I knew that there was a land on the other side of this ocean, then I would certainly not stop until I found a way to deliver the message of Islam to that land. And I think there's a few interesting things here. One is that kind of gives a sense of what was going to be the Muslims' perception of the Atlantic Ocean for a long time. Obviously, there were Muslims in West Africa, there were Muslims in Morocco, there were Muslims in Al-Andalus in Spain as well for centuries and centuries. And while we have a few records of sort of Muslims foraying into the Atlantic Ocean and, out of curiosity, for exploration, trying to find opportunities to trade or travel, whatever the reasons might have been. I will say very clearly, to the best of my knowledge and understanding of researching this topic for over 10 years, there is no concrete evidence that Muslims had a presence in the Americas before the era of European colonialism. Now, I want to unpack that a little bit because there are, as we mentioned, different stories about sort of people who ventured out, by sailing into the Atlantic Ocean and eventually came back, and they would describe islands and places that they had been to, and goods that they had received there. But there are many possibilities. There are islands in the Atlantic Ocean that are not in the Americas, right? So you have um, the Canary Islands, the Azores. You have many other islands, the Madeira Islands that they might have went to. There were people living there, and they might have interacted with them, traded, and come back. The most interesting story in this regard is a story told by the famous West African king Mansa Musa about his predecessor, the king of Mali, whose name was Mansa Abu Bakr or Mansa Muhammad. And it is said by Mansa Musa, he's saying this in about the year 1327. He's saying that my predecessor basically was very interested in exploring the Atlantic Ocean. And so he organized two expeditions from West Africa. First one was in 1310, and the second one was in 1312. And the first one kind of went out there. There was a lot of preparation that was done. These observatories were built on the coast to get a sense of the Atlantic Ocean, which to the Muslims, by the way, was known by two names as Bahr al-Muhit, the all-encompassing ocean. So again, they didn't think that there was land there. So they thought it was Bahr al-Muhit, that if you sail westward, you will eventually find your way to Asia. And it was also known as Bahr al-Zulumat, which is the Sea of Darkness, right? It's the direction in which the sun sets. It's kind of an unknown, uncharted expanse that they haven't really explored. There's a lot of curiosity, but a lot of mystique about it as well. So this particular individual, Mansa Muhammad, this king, he organizes these two expeditions after a lot of preparation. First one fails, but there are some survivors who return in 1310. And then the second one, he decides to lead personally, and he leaves his kingdom and actually leaves his position and says, I'm going to lead it personally. And he was basically never seen again. And this massive expedition of thousands of people was never seen again. So it's not impossible that Muslims reach the Americas. You can factor in so many different factors, like the ocean currents would have naturally carried them from a place in West Africa to a place, near the mouth of the Amazon River in Brazil, for example. So all of these things are certainly possibilities. And to say that there's no concrete, conclusive evidence of Muslim presence in the Americas, something to be said about that is that in the field of history, we say that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because we have, let's say, literary evidence or something that suggests that something might have happened, but we don't have other forms of evidence. There's no archaeological evidence, right? For example, that we can refer to. That doesn't mean that the event did not happen. That just means that we don't have enough evidence yet, or we have evidence, but we've interpreted it the wrong way. Like, maybe I'm looking at the evidence right now that shows that Muslims were clearly here in the Americas, but I have misinterpreted it in some way so that my thoughts have gone in a completely different direction. So this is to say that we don't kind of dismiss, sometimes Muslims, I think we believe very strongly both ways. Like we're very happy to believe that Muslims reached the Americas before the Europeans, and we had a different relationship, especially with the indigenous peoples. I think that's a huge point there, that we did not do what Christopher Columbus and John Cabot and Amerigo de Vespucci and all the others, kind of the impact that they had, very harmful impact on indigenous peoples. We were different. That's our kind of approach. But at the same time, there's the other extreme as well, where people will very aggressively deny that any such thing could have happened. And I think at the moment, based on what we know, the truth is somewhere in between. And then one last thing I'll share here is that even conceptually, one of the people who we can think about in quote unquote the discovery of America is Al-Biruni, Abu Rayhan Al-Biruni, who was actually a Muslim scientist and polymath who lived in Central Asia and in the Pakistan region as well, about 1,000 years ago, literally 1,000 years ago. And he was interested in astronomy. He was interested in geography, all of these subjects. And so he's known for calculating the circumference of the Earth. At that time, just using the most basic technology. There's obviously no satellites or anything that he can refer to. So he calculates the circumference of the Earth. He's off by about a few hundred kilometers, so very, very close to what the actual number was confirmed. So extremely impressive achievement. And then he says, like just as a side note, he says geographically it wouldn't make sense for what we know as Bahr al Muhit to just be an empty ocean. Like for the Earth to have a certain balance, for its rotation to work the way it does, there must be like a landmass of significant size um, in the ocean that we believe has no landmass, right? So he's kind of alluding to the fact that the Americas exist. And then he goes even further and he says there's no reason to believe that people don't already live there, right? So he's also alluding to the existence and the presence of the indigenous peoples. Obviously, he doesn't know any of this. He can't confirm it, but it's still very interesting that that the thought experiment was there about the Americas. So this is the Muslims kind of the prelude to the actual Muslim presence in the Americas, if you will.
That's all really fascinating, and I think it's so interesting how people, they've always just wanted to explore, right? And I think it's really fascinating how people with so little, they don't have the technology, are trying to figure out the circumference of the earth. Like it's really amazing. And the fact that he got so close, that's amazing. That's so cool. But I think you're right. Sometimes when there's not evidence of certain things, we want to believe in the best outcome, right? So I know that we may not always have evidence, and there's probably some stories we've missed. But there is a story of someone named Esteban the Moor. He's known as an explorer of the United States. So what is the story with him?
Okay, so the story of Esteban the Moor is, I think, a really fascinating one, and I imagine at some point, if it hasn't happened already, somebody will probably turn it into like a movie or something. Like this is a very, very um, amazing story. So the first thing to say here is that so this is in the area of sort of European colonialism that this story takes place. So obviously you have Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus's westward voyage is deeply linked with what was happening to the Muslims in Al-Andalus, in Spain and Portugal at that time. The Kingdom of Granada, the last remaining Muslim kingdom, was really fighting for its life, and eventually in 1492 it would completely collapse, bringing an end to not the Muslim presence in Spain, but certainly the Muslim sort of power in Spain. And in that same year, Christopher Columbus, in that same place, right, from the Alhambra, this is where he meets Ferdinand and Isabella, and they gave him the sort of support that he needed to begin this westward voyage to reach India, or to reach China, to reach Asia that he thought he would reach if he sailed westward. But he's relying on Muslims for, astronomical sort of guidance. He's relying on the knowledge of the Muslims even as he prepares for that voyage. So that's one angle there. The second one is that there are some Muslims who are said to have been on his initial voyage, who were actually on his ships coming alongside with him, even though identities were kind of muddled at the time for Muslims. And obviously, the context is that there's an inquisition happening. So the Muslims are facing a lot of pressure, a lot of oppression. So it's in their best interest to sort of hide their true identities, to change their name to something that sounds a little bit more Christian, just to avoid any unfortunate consequences of really coming forward as Muslims at the time. And then the third angle there is that when Columbus eventually runs into the indigenous peoples, when he runs into the Americas, his sort of perception of them is shaped very much by um, the experience that the Christian powers have just dealt to the Muslims in Al-Andalus, right? That this is how you subjugate a people. This is how you enslave a people. This is how you forcibly change the religion of a people. So he's very clearly making these connections. And then the other thing is that what we must always keep in mind is this very interesting connection, I think is worth mentioning, to Beit al-Maqdis, to Jerusalem as well. Because one of the first things that Columbus wrote in his letters back to his sponsors of his voyage, Ferdinand and Isabella, is that we can enslave thousands of these indigenous people and use them as a slave army, basically, take them all the way to Jerusalem and take Jerusalem from the Muslims, right? So always keeping in mind that the end goal for a lot of what has gone on in world history, especially from the European Christian standpoint, has been um, kind of to retake Jerusalem. And this is part of the story of the Crusades as well. This is the ongoing sort of continuation of the Crusades, even though we think of the Crusades as having ended like a couple of centuries before Columbus's time. But it's important to keep that in mind. So all that being said, what's happening now is that you have a group of people in Europe who are known as the Moriscos. So these are Muslims who have outwardly embraced Christianity to save their lives. They've changed their names, they've changed their public appearance and what they do publicly and their practices. But it's kind of known by everybody, but that inside the home, inside their most private lives, they are still Muslim, right? They have faith in their hearts and they're trying to preserve whatever they can of the religion and try to pass that down to their children as well. In very, very extremely difficult circumstances, if you read the history of the fall of Muslim Spain. So that's one angle. And then the second angle, of course, is it's at this time that the Spanish and the Portuguese have also begun to colonize West Africa to some extent. And they've started to actually enslave West Africans for the first time for these new colonies that are developing in the Americas. Like, we need labor. We're going to need a lot of labor. So we're going to bring people there. So one of the people that's brought very, very early on is this individual named Esteban de Moor in historical sources, but his actual name in Arabic was Mustafa Azamuri. So his name is Mustafa Azamuri. Azamur is a place in Morocco. So he's West African. He's a black Muslim. He's from Morocco, from this place called Azamur. He is enslaved through some circumstance, and then he's brought as an enslaved person very early on in the 1520s. So this is just about 30 years after Columbus's time, to their new capital of New Spain, which is Havana in Cuba today. And so Cuba is this hub where all of these people are initially being brought, and a lot of interesting things are going on in Cuba. One of the first things that the Spanish actually tried to do when they got to Cuba was to they plant dates, right? Because with the Muslim culture in Spain, they had become so used to eating dates that they tried to sort of transport the date palm plant to Cuba and see if it was going to work there as well. And it didn't really work, but even today, there's like a famous place in Cuba. There's a town that's called El Datil, which is like the date, right? It's still remembered as the place of the dates that they tried to establish that presence in. They also brought institutions, right? So al-muhtasib, like the muhtasib in Islamic culture, is the person who is like the market inspector. And they since the earliest times, since the times of the Sahaba, you had a market inspector, someone who was sort of in charge of regulating the market, making sure that nothing illegal or harmful is happening, that people are trading fairly, etc. Everything is in order publicly in society. And so that had become part of even Spanish Christian culture, which they borrowed from the Muslims, and then they brought that over. And then you can go on with other influences, right? I mean, to this day, actually, there are homes that you can find in all over Latin America, like Spanish America, that have what you would think are chimneys, but it's not a chimney. It doesn't function as a chimney. It's just a minaret, right? But they have kind of like a little tower, like this concept of having a minaret even in the home. Like it looks like a mosque, actually. You walk by a place and it looks like a mosque, but it's just somebody's house, and it's the way that it was designed with that Andalusi culture. So sorry, I digressed a little bit, but going back to Esteban de Moor. So Mustafa Azamuri is brought as a slave, and he is in Cuba. The year is 1527, and there's an expedition being organized called the Narvaez expedition. And the point of this expedition is we're going to go from Cuba now to trying to colonize the mainland United States. And the first place we're going to go to is this very close by place that later became known as Florida, right? So the Spanish are now trying to conquer Florida in 1527. And Esteban is part of this expedition. Now, the indigenous people of Florida basically make very quick work of the invading Spanish forces, right, including these enslaved people. And there may have been other enslaved Muslims in that expedition as well. So from the hundreds of people who land on the coast of Florida. They're forced to march through the Florida climate. Anyone who's been to Florida, it's very hot, right? It's very marshy. It's not a great place to, go for a very long walk with your heavy guns and everything else that you have to carry as a soldier. So out of these hundreds of people, they reached the sort of north of Florida, and there are only four survivors. And one of those four is Mustafa Azamuri. He has survived, and now, I mean, like, he's not really enslaved anymore. There's only four survivors. They've been through a lot together. The other three people are sort of Spaniards, and then you have this one person, Mustafa Zamuri. But I mean, what are they going to make him do? They're barely like alive themselves. And so, but he still stays with them, because where else is he going to go? Like, he actually, at least he can talk to them and understand their language, but this is completely foreign territory. So they say, what are we going to do? We have to get back to Cuba. Our ships are gone. Everything is gone. We have no way of communicating back with Cuba. So they make some rafts. They take some trees and stuff, and they make some rafts, and they start sailing. Instead of sailing sort of south towards Cuba, they end up sailing completely westward through the Gulf of Mexico, and they end up in what is today Galveston, Texas. So they end up in Texas. So now they're even more lost, and they get off the rafts. I mean, they just can't be on the raft forever, and they just start walking. And so for the next 8 years, they're going to walk around with no direction at all over the southwestern United States. So Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, this entire region. And Mexico City had been established, so they kind of knew, they're using the stars and stuff for figuring out the directions. They kind of know where they have to go, but in a real sense, they have no idea. And Mustafa Azamuri is actually the most capable out of all of them, and he becomes the leader of the group at this point. They're meeting indigenous people along the way, and he kind of has healing skills, so he can treat people who have certain illnesses. He has that knowledge, and so the indigenous people realize that, so they respect him as a healer. And he's also able to converse with them. He's able to learn their language more quickly than the Spaniards are, and so he becomes the leader. So yeah, 8 year walk all over the United States, very difficult circumstances, until finally somehow they actually make their way back, meet another group of Spaniards somewhere in Mexico who guide them back to Mexico City. And it's the indigenous people of Texas. They have a saying, even to this day, they say that the first white man our people met was a black man, right? So they say that he was black, but like for us, he was white. Like, he was part of the white people. He was part of the white culture that arrived. And there's still stories that are told about this individual who he taught us to pray at around sunrise, and he taught us to pray around sunset. Like, this is the kind of thing that he would do himself, and he would teach the indigenous people as he met them as well. So that's basically the story of Esteban the Moor. This is one of the few stories in Islamic history that I think there's been an English novel written about, that is like a really good novel. Like, it's a very good read, and it's called The Moor's Account, right? So he became known as Esteban the Moor, and the book based on his story is called The Moor's Account, which I would highly recommend to everybody.
That's so interesting. I feel like I've never heard about any of that. And and I grew up in the US, right? And so in history class, and I was in a small town in the South. So we didn't talk about Islam, and all you hear is Christopher Columbus this, Christopher Columbus that. And so there's all these other things going on, all these other people exploring, and you just never hear about it. And I wonder how many people who will watch this, or just, people walking out on the street, if you ask them, do you know the story of Esteban the Moor? They're probably not going to, but I definitely, I think it's interesting too that somebody's written a book, and like you said, it's good. So I was like, oh, I'll have to check that out, learn even more. Right. I also feel bad that they were in the part of like, they're walking without, knowing where they're going, and one of the worst terrains.
Yeah.
It's just hot again. It's just continuously hot, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So, that's tough. So there's another person who has to do with the history of New York City, which is interesting, and that's where World Hijab Day was founded. So we must talk about it. So can you tell us who Anthony the Turk is.
Yeah, absolutely. So New York City obviously is a very important cultural capital of the world today, continues to be. Anthony the Turk is the first identifiable Muslim person that we know who settled in New York City, and a lot earlier than people might expect. And I say the first known because, of course, we'll have to talk about the transatlantic slave trade as well, right? So we talked about
Mhm.
Esteban the Moor, but there were millions in the millions potentially West African Muslims who were enslaved in the Americas, and New York City banned slavery fairly early on compared to the rest of the U.S. But certainly there was slavery in the U.S. Sorry, in New York City as well. But Anthony the Turk has a very interesting, different origin. So he's also kind of wound up in the um, uh, the collapse of Spain, the collapse of Muslim Spain. So Anthony the Turk is basically born in Spain in the year 1607. His father is a Dutch pirate who has converted to Islam and now works with Muslims in North Africa. His mother is an Andalusi, like Spanish Muslim woman, right? So he's mixed Dutch and Spanish. Both of his parents are Muslim, and he himself is also raised as a Muslim, and he's raised in Al Andalus. While this is the whole Morisco situation is happening. Remember, this is now 1607, so there are still Muslims in Spain. They just hide their sort of identities, which is why, for example, the only name we know him by is Anthony. Like we don't know if he had any other name. Same goes for his parents. His mother's name was, Margarita. His father's name was Jan Jansoon Wan Harlem. And you're gonna have that Harlem connection as well, right? So New York City actually initially was New Amsterdam, right? The Dutch colonized New York City first, or that region, and so that's why you have all these names. Like his last name was literally Harlem, which is now a very well-known kind of area of New York. So that being said, in about 1630, he's also involved in sort of piracy, but he wants to get out of that life, and so he comes to a place that what will be familiar because he knows the language and he has sort of the same background, which is again New Amsterdam. So he comes to New York City, crosses the Atlantic Ocean, and he settles in New York City. He becomes a very prosperous farmer and a landowner, and he owned land in a place that is today known as Brooklyn, and it was actually called the Turk's plantation. So it's very interesting. So he's known as a Turk because he was Muslim. And this is an important term to keep in mind when you're studying the history of the Muslims in the Americas, that they're often just going to be referred to as Turks. So he's known as Anthony the Turk by others. And so that's how he kind of identifies himself as well. And his plantation, his large land, his large plot of land in Brooklyn, where he used to farm, became known as the Turk's plantation. So if you actually look at really early maps of New York City, of the Brooklyn area, you'll actually see it labeled as the Turk's plantation. And if you go to the Brooklyn Museum, you can actually see the original deed, right? The original document, which granted him that land, that he would be sort of the owner of that particular land. And so he's the first non-indigenous person to own land that we know of in places like Coney Island. Like all of these are sort of popular cultural reference places today. So he's known, we don't know too much about him. He's known for being unusually tall and strong, not surprising for a Dutch person, mashallah. And also known for his Quran. So one of the main evidences that we have that he maintained his faith throughout his life is his famous Quran. So he would always carry a Quran with him, and that Quran was passed down for generations in his family among his descendants. Even though very very quickly it seems like his family seems to have drifted away from Islam, and they didn't remain Muslim. So what's very fascinating about him though is that his descendants include some very famous people, very famous Americans, including CNN journalist Anderson Cooper. Is one of his descendants. The wife of President John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, is a descendant of Anthony the Turk, as well as like the Vanderbilts. Like the Vanderbilts are known like as one of the wealthiest families in American history. and known especially for their investment in architecture and all of these amazing buildings that exist across the eastern United States. So they're all descendants of him. And there's no connection to his faith or his particular background that remained, except for that Quran. That Quran was passed down for generations until I believe it was ultimately sold at an auction as a historic artifact, because the family themselves, of course, they didn't kind of value it anymore because they had drifted away from Islam. So that's the story of Anthony the Turk. He died in the year 1676. So even 100 years, a century before the United States was formed, before the American Revolution happened, you have this Muslim individual who was one of the most prominent individuals in the society of New York City, who's living in Brooklyn.
Wow, I never would have thought that, the name like Harlem came from a Muslim. That's so cool. I feel like
I'll just be clear though, I don't know if it necessarily came from him,
right.
but he was from the original Harlem in the
Yeah.
Netherlands, right?
Yeah. Super cool. I think it's also really nice that he was known for like his Quran and things like that. Like how nice would it be to be remembered for something like that? That's really cool. So there's kind of something you kind of have to keep going back to, which is people who were enslaved, right? So how many of the West Africans enslaved in the Americas were Muslim, and what was their experience?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the biggest presence of Muslims that we can know for sure, that is documented, that has impact still today on Muslim communities in the Americas is the presence of those who were enslaved through the transatlantic slave trade over a period of about 400 years, beginning in the 1500s and ending in the mid 1800s to late 1800s, depending on where you are. You have approximately 12 million, 12.5 million West African people who are enslaved. And the estimate is that perhaps 25 to 30% of them were Muslim. So we're talking about millions of Muslims over a 400-year period that are enslaved across the Americas. And important to, not center only the United States in this conversation. Certainly there was slavery in the United States, but all of the colonies, this is the early Muslim presence in Jamaica. This is the early Muslim presence in Brazil, for example. Like Brazil was actually the largest recipient of slaves out of any of the colonies in the Americas, right? And Brazil sometimes gets forgotten. So you had like a huge presence of Muslims in Brazil, which would translate to certain events that transpired there, which we'll talk about. But the first thing to keep in mind is, yes, we're talking about millions of people, right? Millions of believing Muslims who went through this very, very disruptive process of slavery, where you are kidnapped in your home and you are transported in very, very brutal conditions across the Atlantic Ocean. If you survive that journey of transportation, then when you arrive, your name, your religion, everything is sort of snatched away from you. And obviously your family and your homeland and all of that has already been sort of taken away from you. And so I think a few things that are interesting to keep in mind here is that one, that Muslims who were enslaved often were able to differentiate themselves a little bit based on some things that are kind of unique to Muslim culture. And one of them is the emphasis on knowledge. The other one is the emphasis on da'wah and actually spreading the message of Islam. And so we see this very clearly in the way that the Muslims were able to organize themselves, because even though in West Africa there was a huge amount of diversity, so they might be coming from different places and they might be speaking different languages and have different ethnicities and all of these things, but your Fatiha is the same. So you have kind of basic knowledge of Arabic, right? Everybody understands the adhan, everybody understands like who the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is. So these basic things that are also the most important things in your life, your faith that you're holding on to internally, that the slave owners can never take away from you, is what's kind of pulling you together and helping you organize across all of these other differences that exist in this very difficult situation. The other thing, as we mentioned, is dawah. So the Spanish, especially, who were the first to colonize the Americas, in the first 50 years after Columbus, in the first 50 years after uh, the colonization began, they issued 5 different laws banning the import of enslaved Muslims to the Americas, actually banning it. Right. So for the people who were involved in the business of slavery, it was told to them that you cannot bring Muslims. Why? The reason being that they would constantly try to run away and convert the indigenous people to Islam. Right. So it was said that there would be a bad influence. And also because the Muslims had memories of a power struggle with Spain that was still relatively fresh. So they still had this confidence, it was felt, that, they are rebellious against, especially the Spanish, right? Because we've just had like this long entanglement that lasted for many, many centuries. And so, yes, they might have the upper hand right now, but hey, maybe we have a different opportunity in Mexico that where we can fight back against the Spanish and get the indigenous people involved, get them on our side, and we can all kind of push the Spanish out. So these are all like the paranoia in the Spanish colonial authorities. And it did exist as well. There were brutal punishments that are recorded for Muslims who were caught and accused of the crime of spreading Islam to the indigenous people. Um, uh, like one of them is an individual who was caught in 1540 in what is today Costa Rica. And he was condemned for that crime, quote unquote, and he was boiled alive. That was his punishment. Like he was actually boiled alive. Others were in Peru. There's an example from 1560 of an individual who was given a life sentence, life in prison for the crime that he was suspected of actually trying to spread Islam. And we find examples of, it's not just a false accusation. I should say the Muslims actually did this, right? And we're not surprised. And, may Allah grant them all Jannatul Firdaus for the extreme difficulties that they endured and still had that spirit of spreading the message of Islam. If it's the last thing I do, I'm going to go tell an indigenous person about Islam and try to organize them against this oppression that's happening against them and against us in this particular society. And so that's one aspect, right? The dawah aspect. The other aspect as well is that the Muslims were, as we mentioned, educated, so that would help them organize themselves. That also helped them record some of their experiences. So Umar ibn Said, for example, is a famous enslaved person in the United States who was known, despite having been enslaved for many, many decades, that he still retained his ability to write in the Arabic language. And so he would write, the Fatiha even decades after he was enslaved as a very young person. I think the most famous story is of a person named Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who actually, he was also enslaved in the United States in the 1700s, early 1700s. And he's one of the very, very few people who was enslaved and was able to ultimately return home to his family as a free person in West Africa, which is like impossible, which is not supposed to happen. And the way it happened, just to summarize it really quickly, it's an incredible story. But basically, you have this person, he's enslaved, he's brought to Maryland, right, in the United States. Early 1700s. He's obviously in a very difficult situation. He tries to sneak away to pray all the time from the plantation where he's forced to work. He prays in the woods, and eventually he gets caught. He gets prevented from praying, and he just decides to run away. And so he's running away. He makes it all the way to Pennsylvania. Just you have nowhere to go, right? Like where are you going to go? You're a runaway sort of fugitive. And he gets put in jail in Pennsylvania, but obviously they don't know who he belongs to, so they're just going to keep him in jail. And in jail, he starts writing in Arabic on the wall, right? We don't know for sure what he was writing. And he's asked at one point to identify himself, and he understands like a little bit conversational English by this point. So they ask him like, "What is your name? Where did you come from? Right? Like, who is your master?" Like the way they would ask, and he says, he only says 2 words. He says, "Allah Muhammad." Right? He keeps repeating it. He says, "Allah Muhammad, Allah Muhammad." Like that is my identity, right? So they're very curious, and they bring in like they clearly can tell that he knows Arabic. So they bring in an expert in Arabic. It's like, hey, this guy's saying Allah Muhammad. He's writing things on the wall. We don't know what he's writing. So there's an expert who happens to be in the area. They bring him in, and he says, instead of like being the interpreter so you guys can oppress this guy further, I'm actually going to arrange for his freedom, and I'm going to take him back with me to the UK where I came from. So he actually gets his freedom that way. He's taken to the UK. In the UK, he becomes such a celebrity locally because of his knowledge again, um, that he's actually rubbing shoulders with the royal family in the UK all of a sudden, from being enslaved in Maryland to he's going to all of these like high society gatherings in the UK as a person of knowledge, as a person people have a lot of curiosity about. There's a painting, a famous painting that one of the artists in the UK has made, which is the cover of the book by Sylviane Diouf, which I highly recommend. Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas, by Professor Sylviane Diouf, must read for Muslims. But the point being that like he's on the cover of that amazing painting that was made of him, and he kind of really like shocked people. They would ask him to. So basically, he wrote 3 copies of the Quran by hand from memory while he was in the UK. He had memorized the Quran, so he writes it by hand, which is like a fascinating thing. So they make him write 1 copy, and they say, okay, now we're going to hide this one from you, and now write it again, just to make sure you don't just copy like the one that you just made originally. And then he makes another copy from memory, and then they're comparing them, and like it's all no discrepancy, like because he has it memorized, right? Subhanallah. And then ultimately, he's able to find a way, get some support to return to his family back in West Africa, which is like almost unheard of in the history of slavery. And there's many, many other stories, but I just want to talk about like the very quickly. I know we're coming up on our time here as well, but the lingering impact of that and just what it means for Muslims across the Americas today to remember the kind of struggle to maintain the faith, right? So in Brazil, for example, in 1835, you have the Mali Rebellion. So you have a group of Muslims who have been able to secure their freedom in some way, and they actually want to rebel against the government for the oppression that is being committed against all sort of West African people. That's the Mali Revolt. They actually do it in the month of Ramadan in the year 1835. One of the largest slave revolts in American history is led by Muslims. And that group of Muslims that had sort of been able to secure their freedom to some extent, is fascinating that one of the first things that they organized as soon as they were able to do that, like gain their freedom, was start collecting and distributing zakat among themselves, right? So you think about the fact that everything's been taken away from you. You most likely don't even meet like the threshold, like the nisab that you would have to meet to pay the zakat. And all that notwithstanding, you're still like one of the first things you do among yourselves is like, no, we have to pay the zakat. We're Muslim. As soon as you're free, you start to collect whatever you have and redistribute it. There was another case in the United States, in Georgia, in the southern United States, where in 1830, there's a woman named Katie Brown who was interviewed. And she said, my grandmother, I remember, she used to pray at this time, and she used to bow down, and she used to say this and that. And she, every Friday, she used to make these rice cakes, right? Like rice and honey, and make like these little sweet treats, and give them out to kids and people in the community. And she used to call it sadaqah, right? So this is obviously the word sadaqah in Arabic, but the whole meaning had been forgotten. So she used to give sadaqah, but her descendants thought that the sadaqah that she used to talk about was actually the cake itself, like the rice cake. She didn't have money to give away to anybody, so she just had some rice and honey at her disposal. So she would make these rice cakes and then give them out to kids and stuff like that, right? So this is how the legacy kind of lingered. I mean, now we're talking about the 1930s, where somebody still remembers that my grandmother here in Georgia used to do something like that. And then, of course, you have very importantly, like that lingering influence, even though Islam kind of died out in the United States and the Americas for the most part in the late 1800s. But when we talk about the stories of the Malcolm X's of the world and the Muhammad Ali's and these people who are going to have an enormous influence on Islam, not just in the Americas, but actually all over the world, there's that lingering cultural memory. And you think about the amount of effort and sacrifice that went into preserving any little aspect of Islam for those people, right? If all I can do is take some honey and some rice and make rice cakes and give it out, like this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala carrying your legacy, because your grandchildren are still going to remember that. right? That there was something called sadaqah, etc. So there's a lot to unpack here. I definitely recommend the book that I mentioned by Sylvie Andiouf, Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas.
I feel like every time you tell a story or, add a little bit more information, it's just like, wow, like it's just like mind blowing to me. And, because the UK and even America today, oftentimes they're like, like, oh, we don't want Muslims, changing things, coming in, living here. And I'm like, but Muslims have always been around. And it sounds like so at some point, like even in the UK, they were a little more inviting, fascinated by people and learning. And I feel like if people just learn these things, they'd be more accepting.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. And I feel like we could probably talk for, I was going to say for hours, but probably days about this history. It seems like there's just so much. So we definitely have to do this again another time because there's just so much more to learn. But thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. And I definitely hope the conversation continues. And please do read the books for anybody who's listening that were recommended, because this is just the start of a very fascinating. If you like these stories, there's a lot more. There's a lot more that's going to completely open your eyes to perspectives and beauty in the history and presence of Muslims in the Americas than what was discussed here.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone out there who watched live and who will watch this afterwards. And don't forget to join me every Friday in May as I interview others to talk about Muslim history. I'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.